Hello, welcome to our session on climate change, geoengineering, and near existential risks. My name is Michael, and I'm happy to introduce Ted Parson. Ted Parson is the Dan and Ray Emmett Professor of Environmental Law and the faculty co-director of the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the University of California, Los Angeles. Parson studies international environmental law and policy, the societal impacts of governance of disruptive technologies, including geoengineering and artificial intelligence, and the political economy of regulation. Parson co-directs the AI Pools program at UCLA Law and organized the 2019 Summer Institute on AI and Society. His articles have appeared in Science, Nature, Climatic Change, Issues in Science and Technology, the Journal of Economic Literature, and the Annual Review of Energy and the Environment. Today, Ted will be discussing the potential promise and risks of using solar geoengineering to help mitigate climate change. As with our previous sessions, we invite you to use the SwapCord platform on the right-hand side panel. Feel free to share your thoughts on the live discussion board and leave and upvote any questions and for our speaker to answer at the end of the presentation. After the session, we invite you to use SwapCord to set up meetings with fellow conference attendees. Without further ado, please welcome Ted Parson.
Great. Thank you for that introduction, Michael. Are my slides live? Great. I see. Okay. I'm going to give you a very rapid introduction to the landscape of climate change risks and responses and the risks of responses. And then in the last few minutes of my remarks, I'm going to try to connect these to the discussion you're having all day about existential risks. So here's a short picture of where the world is headed regarding climate change. This one is from the NGO Climate Interactive, which provides a scorecard of current commitments to reductions of greenhouse gas emissions. As you can see, what this says is that under the assumption that all current national targets and proposals are fully implemented and sustained, the world is headed to a midpoint estimate of heating up by 3.2 degrees C above pre-industrial by the end of the century. If we don't do as well as that and emissions are higher following a more business as usual trajectory, it's 4 or more. And of course, the goals at the Paris commitments are 2 or 1.5. Now, the main and first way to limit risks of climate change is to cut human emissions of greenhouse gases to zero or to very close to zero. This has been obvious for about 30 years, but the character of the task and the relationship we have to it is very different now than it was in the 1990s. In the 1990s, it was a huge task requiring a massive transformation of every aspect of the economy, but it was a task that there were decades available to accomplish. Now, with 30 years of very weak progress on climate policy and emission reductions, the world is more and more tightly boxed in and there are fewer options. Now, the current state of political aspirations about climate change is articulated in the Paris targets of 2015, in which national governments agreed in an international agreement to hold global average heating, quote, well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and to aim to do better than that and get as close as possible to holding it to 1.5. And for context, today we're just nudging 1.2, so there's not a lot of headroom left. It's important to note what these targets are not. The Paris target is not a scientifically authoritative boundary of catastrophic risk, nor is it a point below which things are safe. It's a scientifically informed political proxy for a level of climate change that was judged to be manageable or adaptable. And information is still coming in, and increasingly it looks like 2 degrees C is still pretty bad, especially for the most vulnerable people and places in the world. It's also worth noting that whether or not it's actually possible to achieve the Paris target by cutting emissions alone, as opposed to the additional response options I'm going to introduce in just a moment, is deeply contested. You can see extreme claims basically asserting it can still be done. It's not even that hard. We just need to get our act together and confront entrenched interests in favor of increased emissions. And you can see claims that it's technically, economically, or politically impossible. It's certainly the case that even holding to 2 is beyond certain is too strong. It's very likely the case that even holding to 2 is beyond what can be done with technical change alone, but would require, in addition, changes in behavior and patterns of consumption. As to whether it's possible with emissions cuts alone or not, it's not really well known. Now, part of the reason that that's not well known, part of the ambiguity in the achievability of the Paris targets, is the prominent role of a second type of response option that has kind of emerged to great prominence in the past 10 years or so. Atmospheric removal of greenhouse gases after they've been emitted. Carbon dioxide removal, or CDR for short. Since 2010 or so, CDR has played a huge role in almost all of the scenarios that demonstrate the feasibility of achieving the Paris targets. Here's a picture from an illustrative or a representative one by Rockstrom et al., in which they propose cutting human emissions by half every decade, but that's not enough. On top of that, they have a large ramp up of active human removals of carbon from the atmosphere, and that allows the possibility of holding to either 2 or 1.5. Now, the addition of carbon dioxide removal onto the set of response options is mostly good and maybe a little bit of bad news. It's a huge help in terms of expanding risk management capability to limit climate change, but it's also subject to a few general limits and potential new risks. First, it is unlikely that CDR will make a big difference very soon. It's a stock flow problem. Basically, sucking greenhouse gases back out of the atmosphere is draining a lake through a straw. You can do it, but it takes a long time, in addition to the time that it takes to scale up the activity. Second, the new prominence of CDR and of focusing on net emissions, including net zero targets, blurs the distinction between current emissions being reduced and removals that are offsetting them. Now, that's not a problem if they really are traded off one-to-one with complete reliability, but there are various risks. CDR makes the problem easier, but it might make it seem easier more than it really does make it easier, and so it might raise risks of unreliable claimed removals, of removals that aren't stable and don't stay out of the atmosphere long enough, or of sloppy accounting, such that emissions and reductions get double counted. CDR also amounts to basically delaying the pain, paying back a near-term debt by emitting too much, by promising to remove it in the future, and that means gambling that it works and scales. And then there's a longer-term problem, which is that if it does work fabulously, it even works in a way that has viable, profitable business models, and it gets huge enough to do a large drawdown to restore climate to some prior state, then you've sort of reconstructed something that looks a lot like the fossil fuel economy, and it raises the question how you turn it off when you're done, which Holly Buck and I explored in a recent paper. Okay, the third broad response type I'm going to introduce is solar geoengineering, meaning active engineered interventions that change the energy balance or the radiation balance of the Earth relative to the sun and the space around. There's a few different ways to do it, of which the most promising one appears to involve spraying a fine mist of reflective aerosols in the upper atmosphere. Here's a figure from the National Academy's committee report that came out just a couple of weeks ago. This stuff is big news. It is big and hopeful and scary news and controversial news at the same time. These interventions may allow the possibility of large reductions in climate change risks that aren't available through any other means. Although they do not solve the whole problem, they are not a complete replacement for emission cuts, and thus it is a serious mistake to imagine that this is a kind of a technical silver bullet solution, but it's a big increase in capability. And it also adds a bunch of new uncertainties and risks. Certainly, an active intervention in the environment raises the risks of unexpected or harmful environmental impacts, of which several have been identified and investigated. It doesn't actually reverse the climate effects of greenhouse gases because it pushes back in a different way from the way that greenhouse gases are pushing. It may affect stratospheric chemistry, including ozone. Depending upon what material you spray, it may increase acidifying deposition. The early research on these interventions, which has all been conducted in labs and in computer models, plus some observations of natural phenomena like volcanic observations, is extremely promising on these, but it's early research. It's absolutely not assured that this stuff will work and will work with acceptable side effects, but it looks pretty promising. On the other hand, the additional risks that it introduces are more indirect. They are risks that are related to questions of the form, how would this be used in real social and political contexts? And it's not hard at all to think of some pretty frightening ways that this stuff could be used. It could be used in a panic. It could be used recklessly or incompetently. It could be used, although the capabilities don't look really promising in terms of biasing it for regional advantage, you could imagine a possibility that people would try. It might undermine or distract from emissions cuts, which wouldn't be a problem if it was a perfect, complete, reliable solution or alternative to emissions cuts, but it's not, so it is. And in the long term, there's a problem of time constants. If this is used to a significant degree, and emissions are not reduced or carbon dioxide removal is not going on an equivalent scale, then there's a couple of very severe long-term risks that arise. One of which is that you get stuck and basically have to keep doing this forever. And then the other one is that it is stopped suddenly, and because the atmospheric lifetime of the stuff sprayed in the upper atmosphere is relatively short, if you stop a program of putting it in, the suppressed heating would be recaptured quickly over just a couple of years with far more severe impact. For all these reasons and more, these interventions are highly controversial and raise many serious and legitimate concerns. The concerns in the first instance are about the identified risks I've just quickly gone through. People also object and express concerns about these interventions for two other classes of reasons, one of which is related to politics and control. The expectation or suspicion that if there are not legitimate participatory mechanisms for control of the details of interventions, that it could be used in a way that is rivalrous, unjust, that sustains current inequities, suppresses development. And then there's a set of non-consequential objections people have expressed, mostly in metaphor or image. It's a technical fix. It's an expression of hubris. It's an expression of a presumptuous assertion of human control over the earth, the Anthropocene. Okay, put these all together, and just for today's talk, I've actually done a little exercise of sketching a few scenarios that capture the major alternative risk pathways that are associated with climate change and its response. I'm going to just identify them very quickly and then move on to a discussion of existential risks. So there's a few, and no, good, bad, and ugly scenarios. So green, good, yellow, bad, red, ugly. The first few just relate to what trajectory human society follows through this century on the hugely wide fan of possible emissions trajectories and their implications for heating. So if the world races along the highest of projections of future emissions, those that are known by the scenario names RCP 8.5 or SSP 5 in IPCC speak, then we could head to total heating of 4 to 6 C by the end of the century. It's really bad. It's also it's contested how likely such high emission scenarios are to happen, but can't say they're impossible. Could be higher. The more likely mid-range projections in which controls on emissions strengthen, but not to an extreme degree, leads to middle scenarios in which heating by the end of the century is well above the Paris targets, but not as bad as on the top scenarios, 2.5 to 4. Or if cuts are much, much stronger and we have good luck, then maybe aggressive cuts alone. This is that contestability about the feasibility of the Paris targets that I alluded to a few minutes ago. Maybe they could lead us to 2. Add in the other response types and you get additional scenarios of good or bad possible outcomes. Adding CDR, well, removing is in the same units, the same currency as emitting. So the main effect of different degrees of success with CDR is to move up or down among alternative heating scenarios as were already defined by alternative emissions trajectories. So if we gamble heavily on CDR and it turns out not to work or raise serious problems and not be pursuable at large scale, then basically you move up or down between these. If it works really well, you could have a happy scenario where it works, it scales, it's governed okay, and it draws down and exits. And in that strange sanctuary hence scenario that I briefly alluded to a moment ago, if you run an enterprise that is creating large net negative emissions and then the drawdown period is over and it's time to turn it off, but it's a huge enterprise, it looks like fossil fuels today and it's hard to turn off, you could imagine a very bad scenario of getting stuck pushing climate in the opposite direction. Add solar geoengineering, you get still more scenarios. So a middle range one is that we keep arguing about it for a long, long, long time. And the prospect of its being available subtly undermines other responses, but it never gets used. That's the yellow scenario I've identified here, where you're back to the same picture. It's a question of how hot it gets by the end of the century. But the present but non-use of solar geoengineering has made it a little worse. The opposite extreme would be one in which research is done, technologies are developed, it works okay, the side effects are moderate and widely judged to be acceptable. Effective and legitimate means of controlling it are developed and implemented, and then it could be a huge contribution to a safer, a more climate safe and sustainable world by buying time for the huge cuts in emissions and CDR that are necessary. And then the two bad ones are, as I alluded to, the world over-relies on this, misinterprets it as a complete solution when it really isn't, and then we get stuck. And if you get stuck doing this at a high intensity for a long time and emissions haven't come down and CDR is not being done at a huge scale, then you get caught basically between two converging cliffs where, on the one side, you keep doing this forever and things get worse and worse gradually, and on the other side, stop suddenly and then you get a termination shock. The other bad scenario is that it's rolled out badly and it poisons the well due to failure, bad impacts, conflict, or whatever. That would be bad in the near term. It would perhaps be worse in the long term because if the option becomes unavailable and turns out at some future time to be necessary, then the world would have to face that future situation with fewer tools to rely upon. Okay, in my last few minutes, let me quickly connect climate change and geoengineering to existential risk. I'm going to follow Toby's very nice and cogent definition of existential risk from his book, where something's an existential risk if it poses a non-negligible probability of ending the human prospect. It's a powerful analytic construct. It suggests that there might be a commonality across multiple risks that have this characteristic. But if you want to look at climate and geoengineering in those terms, I would suggest that in fact they don't quite meet the threshold of comprising existential risks. You have to go to extreme scenarios of malfeasance or collective suicide that are kind of weird to get to really existential risk. On the other hand, I would note that a risk need not be existential for it to represent enormous disruption and suffering and thus present a strong warrant for action, as is the case with climate change. So how does the concept of existential risk inform climate response? One, maybe what it does is raises the alarm and generates support for stronger measures, perhaps because there could be developed a common capacity, a governance capability to assess and respond across multiple risks. Maybe the main effect of thinking in terms of existential risks is to shift attention within the probability distribution of potential risks from climate change. The debate presently concentrates far too much on the middle and ignores high-end risks. And so shifting attention toward upper possibilities might be really constructive, although you would then have to worry about the possibility that the things you would do to address the tail of the distribution might be different from and compete with the things you would do to manage other parts of the distribution. An important and subtle one is that talking about existential risks shifts attention from rival interests to shared interests. So across many types of risks, it is the case that as the peril gets more extreme, it tends to be more shared. And thus the way people speak in terms of existential risks using what I call the rhetorical we face annihilation, we must do this, it gets more valid. But of course, framing it that way, you are jumping around the possibility that there might not be a relevant we. People might not agree. There might have to be political decision-making and consensus building. Turn the question around for my last couple of remarks and say, how does climate and geoengineering help inform broader thinking about existential risks? So I did it one way, how do existential risks help inform the climate debate, and now I'm doing it the other way around. Here, the main implications here, I think, are actually cautionary lessons from the decades of frustrating experience trying to mobilize effective climate action about barriers to effective collective response. And maybe that applies to all risks. Maybe it's different for existential risks. But let me propose that the types of concrete responses available via collective action have a sort of commonality across multiple kinds of risks and other policy issues. If you think, how can we manage this risk? The classes of responses tend to be, we can exert collective authority to make people or incent people to do stuff other than what they would do. That's regulation. We can spend public money. We can do research, build institutions, develop technology, or otherwise build capacity for longer-term response, or we can talk. The point I would make for existential risks is that the politics differs across these types of responses in ways that are not necessarily well aligned with their effective contribution to limiting the risk. It's sort of obvious to say that in general there is a political preference for easier actions or ones that delay problems. So talking is favored over capacity building, is favored over spending, is favored over regulation. Climate change also illustrates possibly a sharper and more perverse aspect of this political preference, though, which is raised by the huge attention, and in my view, the too much attention that is now being given to carbon dioxide removal. Why does everybody love carbon dioxide removal, and why are they paying so much more attention to it than to reduction of existing emissions? Maybe because as a policy issue, CDR is about spending, not about regulation. Very quickly, because I know I have just a few more minutes, a few other observations from the climate and geoengineering debate, and also drawing on the work I've done in some other technology risks and how they might inform existential risks. First, what responses are available or preferred might depend upon a couple of characteristics of risks that include, one, whether the source of disruption is associated with an increase or a decrease in wealth or scarcity. This broadly distinguishes technology-driven risks from environmental-driven risks, because usually tech risks are apprehended bad side effects of things that people want to do because they make life better. And usually environmental risks are belatedly discovered and represent a contraction relative to what was kind of what we previously expected. Next, and second last, the climate change debate gives a very cautionary lesson about the difficulty of having a rational risk and response deliberation under certain conditions. And the conditions of climate change that make it so hard include that it's clear who would in the first instance bear a lot of the burden of response. That means interests associated with the fossil fuel economy. The uncertainties are not well characterized and thus easy to misrepresent. And so there's a lot of room for both sincere and opportunistic disagreement over the nature and character of the urgency. And third, both the risk and responses to it are easy to express in terms that are ideological or rivalrous and thus otherwise divisive, and thus push hard against the presumption of a sort of a shared global we with common interests that underlies much thinking on existential risks. Final observation is that everybody's favorite answer to how to handle uncertain long-term risks is build adaptive and robust institutions, which is really, it's a very compelling argument. It's a great suggestion, but experience realizing such institutions and authorities has been very difficult for a couple of reasons. One is that existential risk, climate and other existential risks, they tend to have long time horizons. And so you need mechanisms that can pay sustained attention and manage coherent action over long, long time periods. Second, institutions to adaptively manage severe risks plug directly into a deep tension or a contradiction in how many people want our governmental and legal functions to operate. We want them both to be fully responsive to democratic will and to be informed by best available evidence as mobilized by relevant scientific expertise. These are usually in tension. So to say decision makers have to follow science and decision makers have to follow the people, they're both complex. You know, both those slogans are kind of simplistic, but they're not the same, and they pull in different directions of quite significant implications for prospects for managing existential risk. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk, Ted. Unfortunately, I think we only have time for maybe one quick question. Dr. Parson will be conducting an extended Q&A for about 30 minutes afterwards on GatherTown. So please follow that link after we're done. But Dr. Parson, if you could answer just one question. Constantine is curious about your thoughts on the argument that even conducting research into solar geoengineering is unethical because it makes it a more legitimate possibility that potentially provides ammunition to bad actors that are seeking to delay or avoid emissions cuts.
Thanks. It's a very apt question and a point of really sharp controversy. So I can't assert with confidence that that risk mechanism would never occur. But I have to say, I find the chain of sequences of causal links that argument assumes to be implausible to the degree that, in my judgment, it is better to do the research with appropriate controls to ensure that the information available from research is publicly available, is checked for kind of impartiality and scientific quality. It's better to do that and know than it is to suppress research. And perhaps the most decisive reason that I think suppressing research is a terrible idea is that there's a level at which solar geoengineering is so obvious that stopping research does not make it unavailable to future governments or say future national governments facing desperate, rapidly mounting climate impacts and feeling they have no other option. It's a little inside baseball, but I want to say if you're interested in solar geoengineering, you have to read Kim Stanley Robinson's recent work of science fiction, Ministry for the Future, which actually opens with a catastrophic heat wave in central India and a response by the government of India to unilaterally deploy solar geoengineering. That is a very plausible scenario, and suppressing research into solar geoengineering in no way takes that out of the capability of a future government of India or of any other country with sort of strong scientific and technical capability and an urgent climate emergency.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have for this session, but thank you, Dr. Parson, for a wonderful session and your time with us today.
Thank you.